The letter arrived on a Tuesday, innocent-looking among the pile of bills and junk mail. Maria Henderson's fingers trembled as she read the law firm's letterhead, Davidson, Brooks and Associates. The words that followed would shatter her carefully constructed world. We are writing to inform you of your inheritance following the passing of Mr. James Richardson. Maria collapsed into her kitchen chair, the granite countertops of her suburban home suddenly feeling cold and foreign. James Richardson, the name her mother had refused to speak for 35 years. Her father. The man who had abandoned them before she could even walk. $500,000, she whispered, the numbers swimming before her eyes. The inheritance wasn't just money, it was validation of her existence, proof that somewhere in the vast tapestry of her father's life, she had mattered enough to be remembered. The front door clicked open, and John's heavy footsteps echoed through the house. Her husband of 15 years, the steady rock in her life, appeared in the doorway, his tie already loosened after a long day at the accounting firm. You wouldn't believe the day I had, he started, then froze at the sight of her face. Maria? What's wrong? She held out the letter with shaking hands. John's eyes narrowed as he read, his expression darkening with each line. This has to be a scam, he declared, tossing the letter onto the counter. Every week, some new con artist tries to separate people from their money. Remember Mrs. Patterson down the street? Lost her entire retirement fund to something just like this. It's not a scam, John. The firm is real, I googled them. They're one of the most prestigious estate law firms in Boston. Maria stood, her nurse's scrubs rustling. This could be my chance to finally learn about him, to understand why he left. John's jaw tightened. And risk everything we've built? Our savings, our reputation. He stepped closer, his voice softening. I've watched you build yourself up from nothing, become one of the most respected nurses at Memorial. You don't need his money or his validation. Maria turned away, staring out the window at their manicured lawn, the setting sun casting long shadows across the grass. I'm meeting with the lawyer on Thursday. Maria dash. I need to know, John. All my life, there's been this hole. Every Father's Day, every graduation, every milestone, I've smiled and pretended it didn't matter. But it did. It does. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Finally, John sighed. At least let me come with you. If this is legitimate, you'll need someone in your corner. Maria nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead. That night, she lay awake, memories flooding back, her mother's tight-lipped silence whenever she asked about her father, the empty chair at school events, the way other kids whispered behind her back. Now, decades later, he was reaching out from beyond the grave, offering answers to questions she'd buried deep inside. But as she drifted off to sleep, a nagging voice whispered in her mind, "Be careful what you wish for. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again." The next morning, Maria went through her hospital rounds mechanically, her thoughts far from the beeping monitors and routine procedures. During her lunch break, she found herself Googling James Richardson obsessively. The results painted a picture of a successful businessman, a pillar of Boston society. Photos showed him at charity galas, political fundraisers, always with a polished smile and an elegant woman by his side. Her hands clenched around her phone when she found the obituary. Survived by his wife of 40 years, Margaret, and their son, Paul. No mention of a daughter. No acknowledgement of her existence. The familiar pain of rejection threatened to overwhelm her, but this time, it was different. This time, she had proof, cold, hard proof in the form of that inheritance letter, that she hadn't been completely forgotten. As her shift ended, Maria's phone buzzed with a text from John, called the law firm. Meeting confirmed for Thursday. Still think this is a mistake. She typed back a simple, "Thank you," and headed to her car. The setting sun painted the hospital parking lot in shades of gold and shadow, much like her emotions, hope and fear, anticipation and dread, all swirling together into a tempest that threatened to overwhelm her. Tomorrow would bring answers, but also questions she'd never dared to ask. As she drove home, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that she was driving toward more than just a meeting. She was driving toward a collision with her past, and the impact would change everything. Davidson, Brooks and Associates occupied the entire 32nd floor of a gleaming downtown skyscraper. Maria's heels sank into plush carpeting as she and John followed a sleek-suited receptionist through a maze of mahogany and glass. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across their path. "Mrs. Henderson." A tall man with silver-streaked hair rose from behind an imposing desk. "I'm Marcus Davidson. Please, have a seat." His handshake was firm, professional, but there was something in his eyes, pity, concern, that made Maria's stomach clench. John's hand found the small of her back as they sat, his presence both comforting and suffocating. The leather chair creaked beneath her as she perched on its edge, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Before we discuss the details of your father's estate," Davidson began, "there's something you should know." He paused, shuffling papers on his desk. "We have another party contesting the will." Maria's throat went dry. "Contesting?" "Yes. Your father's son, Paul Richardson, has filed a formal challenge." Davidson's words fell like stones into still water. "He claims you are not, in fact, James Richardson's daughter." The room tilted sideways. "A son." Her father had a son. John's hand tightened on her arm, steadying her. "That's ridiculous," John snapped. "You wouldn't have called us here if you didn't have proof of Maria's claim." Davidson nodded, opening a thick file. "We have substantial documentation, birth certificate, dated photographs, even some old letters between your parents." He slid several papers across the desk. "However, Paul's legal team is aggressive. They're arguing that these documents could be falsified." Maria stared at the photographs. Her father, young, handsome, smiling, holding a baby she assumed was her. Her mother, radiant and in love, leaning against his shoulder. The edge of the photo was dated June 1985. "What about my mother?" Her voice sounded distant, strange. "She could testify. We've already reached out to her." Davidson's expression softened. "She's reluctant to get involved." Of course she was. Elena Martinez had spent 35 years building a wall around that chapter of her life. Even now, she refused to discuss James Richardson with her daughter. "Tell me about him," Maria whispered. "About Paul." Davidson hesitated. "Paul Richardson is the CEO of his father's company. He's been running it for the past 5 years, quite successfully. He's married, has 3 children. He and his father were very close." Each word was a knife twisting in her gut. While she'd grown up in a cramped apartment, watching her mother work double shifts to make ends meet, her father had been building an empire with his real family. "The inheritance," John interjected. "How much exactly are we talking about?" "The total estate is valued at approximately $20 million. Davidson's words hung in the air like smoke. "Your father left specific instructions that it be divided equally between his 2 children. 20 million. Maria felt the room spin again. No wonder Paul was fighting this. A sharp knock interrupted them. Davidson's assistant appeared in the doorway, looking apologetic. "I'm sorry, sir, but Mr. Richardson is here. He's quite insistent." Before Davidson could respond, a man pushed past the assistant. Tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Maria's car, Paul Richardson filled the room with his presence. His eyes, their father's eyes, locked onto Maria with laser intensity. "So," he said, voice dripping with contempt, "this is the long-lost sister." He turned to Davidson. I thought we agreed no meetings would take place without both legal teams present. Mr. Richardson, this is highly inappropriate. What's inappropriate is this woman trying to con her way into my father's estate. Paul's hands clenched at his sides. Did you really think you could get away with this? That you could waltz in here with some convenient documents and tear apart everything my father built? Maria stood slowly, her legs shaking. I'm not trying to tear apart anything. I just want What? Money? Recognition? A piece of the Richardson legacy? Paul laughed, but there was no humor in it. Let me make something very clear. My father was a great man. He built something extraordinary, something that's been in our family for generations. I won't let some gold digger with a sob story destroy that. John stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. Watch your mouth. Or what? Paul's smile was razor sharp. You'll sue me. Go ahead. I have an army of lawyers who will bury you in paperwork until your grandchildren are collecting Social Security. He turned back to Maria. Walk away now. Whatever they're paying you to do this, I'll double it. Paying me? Maria's voice cracked. You think I'm being paid to pretend to be your sister? Half-sister, Paul corrected coldly. If that. Though I doubt even that much is true. He pulled out his phone, tapping quickly. Check your email, Davidson. My lawyers are filing for an emergency injunction. Nothing moves forward until we verify every single document, every signature, every date. He strode to the door, then paused. And Maria? Stay away from my family. You've already caused enough damage. The door slammed behind him, leaving a deafening silence. Maria sank back into her chair, tears burning behind her eyes. Mrs. Henderson, Davidson said gently, I know this is overwhelming, but please don't let him intimidate you. If you are who you say you are, and I believe you are, you have every right to your inheritance. John leaned forward. What's our next step? We fight, Davidson replied simply. But I warn you, it won't be easy. Paul Richardson has resources, connections. This could get ugly. Maria stared at the photo on Davidson's desk, her eyes fixed on her father's smile. The same smile she'd just seen on Paul's face, twisted with hate and suspicion. I don't care about the money, she said finally. But I won't let him erase me. Not again. As they left the office, Maria's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, last chance to walk away. Next time, I won't be so nice. She showed it to John, who swore under his breath. But Maria felt something crystallize inside her, a determination that burned away the hurt and confusion. Paul Richardson might have their father's eyes, his smile, his empire. But she had the truth. And she would make him face it, no matter the cost. The small house in East Boston hadn't changed in 30 years. Maria stood on the cracked sidewalk, gathering her courage. Wind whipped down the narrow street, carrying the scent of salt water from the harbor. Behind her, John waited in the car, respecting her need to do this alone. Elena Martinez opened the door before Maria could knock. I knew you'd come, she said softly, her accent thicker than usual. I saw the obituary. The kitchen was exactly as Maria remembered, yellow curtains faded by decades of sun, religious icons watching from every wall, the ancient coffee maker gurgling in the corner. She sat at the formica table, watching her mother's hands shake as she poured coffee into chipped mugs. Why didn't you tell me he was dead? Maria asked. Elena sank into the chair across from her. What difference would it make? He was dead to us long ago. He left me money, Mama. Half his estate. Maria leaned forward. But his son is fighting it. He says I'm lying about being James's daughter. The coffee cup clattered against the saucer. His son. Elena's face went pale. Paul. You knew about him. The betrayal was a fresh wound. All these years, you knew I had a brother. Half-brother, Elena corrected sharply. From his real family. Real family? The words tasted like poison. What were we then? Elena stood abruptly, moving to a cabinet above the refrigerator. She returned with a battered shoebox, its corners soft with age. I kept everything, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Every letter, every picture. I thought, someday you might need them. Maria lifted the lid with trembling fingers. Inside lay her past, preserved in paper and ink. Letters in her father's elegant handwriting, full of promises and plans. Photos she'd never seen, her parents at the beach, at parties, looking young and in love. And at the bottom, a small velvet box. He gave me that ring, Elena said, touching the box gently. Said we would get married as soon as his divorce was final. Maria's head snapped up. Divorce? From Margaret, Paul's mother. Elena's laugh was bitter. He said they were separated, that the marriage was over. I believed him because I wanted to believe. I was 22, working as a housekeeper in his company's downtown office. He was kind to me, charming. Made me feel special. She took a long sip of coffee, her eyes distant. When I told him I was pregnant, he was excited. Said it was a sign we were meant to be together. For 6 months, everything was perfect. He set us up in an apartment, bought things for the baby. Then one day, Margaret showed up at my door. Maria could barely breathe. What happened? She knew everything. About us, about the baby. She said if I didn't disappear, she would make sure I lost my job, my visa, everything. Said she would report me for trying to extort her husband. Elena's hands clenched around her cup. She showed me pictures of Paul, he was only 5 then. Said I would destroy his life, his future. So you left. James came to see me that night. Said he was sorry, but he had responsibilities. His family's company, his reputation, his son. Elena's voice cracked. He offered money to go away quietly. I told him to go to hell. Maria sorted through the letters, noting the dates. They continued for years after she was born, birthday cards, Christmas greetings, always with checks that her mother had never cashed. The last one was dated just 2 years ago. He kept writing, she whispered. All this time. I never read them. Elena stood, moving to the window. But I couldn't throw them away. They were proof that you weren't a mistake, that he knew about you, acknowledged you. A photograph slipped from between the letters. Maria caught her breath. It showed her father holding her in a hospital room, his face glowing with pride. On the back, in his handwriting, my beautiful daughter Maria, born June 15, 85. Paul's lawyers say all of this could be fake, Maria said. They're demanding proof that these are real. Elena turned, her face set with determination. Then we'll give them proof. The doctors, nurses at the hospital, some must still be there. The apartment building where we lived, the neighbors who saw him visit. I kept receipts, bank statements showing his payments. I have his voice on old answering machine tapes. You saved all that? Why? Because I knew this day would come. Elena took Maria's hands in hers. Your father was a coward who chose money and status over love. But he can't erase you. I won't let them erase you. Maria's phone buzzed, another text from Paul, my investigators found your mother. Does she know what happens to illegal immigrants who commit fraud? Rage rose in Maria's throat. He's threatening you now. Let him. Elena's voice was steel. I've survived worse than rich boys with expensive lawyers. As Maria drove home that night, the shoebox secure in her trunk, her mind raced. Paul thought he could bully them into submission, use his money and power to bury the truth. But he didn't understand what he was fighting against, not greed or opportunism, but a mother's love, a daughter's need for identity. The next text came just before midnight, final warning. Walk away, or everything comes out. Everything. Attached was a photo, grainy, decades old, showing her father handing an envelope to her mother in a darkened parking lot. Without context, it looked like exactly what Paul wanted people to believe, a payoff, a cover-up. Maria showed it to John, who whistled softly. "They've been watching you for a while," he said. "Planning this." "Good," Maria replied, surprising herself with her calm. "Let them dig. The deeper they go, the more truth they'll find." But as she lay in bed that night, another photo arrived. This one was recent, Maria leaving the hospital after her shift, talking to a patient's family. The message was clear: "We're watching. We can hurt you." Maria saved the message, her hands steady. Tomorrow, she would take everything to Davidson. Let Paul play his games with private investigators and threatening texts. She had something stronger than money or power. She had the truth. And she was ready to use it. The courthouse loomed before Maria like a fortress of granite and glass. Davidson met them at the entrance, his usual composure showing cracks of concern. "They've filed an emergency motion," he said, rushing them through security. "Paul's team claims to have evidence of fraud." John's hand tightened on Maria's shoulder. "What evidence?" "They won't say. They're presenting it directly to the judge." Davidson's jaw clenched. "It's an unusual move. They must be confident." Courtroom 4B was already packed and they entered. Maria spotted Paul in the front row, surrounded by a phalanx of expensive suits. He didn't turn around, but his posture radiated smug satisfaction. "All rise," the bailiff called as Judge Caroline Wheeler entered, her black robes flowing behind her. She was younger than Maria expected, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Paul's lead attorney, Richard Bennett, rose first. His voice filled the room with practiced authority. "Your Honor, we have uncovered evidence of a systematic attempt to defraud the Richardson estate. What you're about to see proves that Maria Henderson's claim is not just baseless, but criminal." He gestured, and an assistant wheeled in a large display screen. Maria's stomach dropped as familiar images appeared, the photos from her mother's shoebox, the letters, the birth certificate. But something was wrong. The dates were different. The handwriting, while similar, showed subtle inconsistencies. "Our forensic experts have analyzed these documents extensively," Bennett continued. "The paper, the ink, even the photographic processing, all indicate these materials were created recently, not 35 years ago as claimed." Davidson was on his feet instantly. "Objection, Your Honor. We haven't been given access to these alleged experts or their findings. The evidence was only confirmed this morning," Bennett countered smoothly. "But we have the experts standing by to testify. Furthermore," he paused dramatically, "we have a witness who can speak to the fraud directly." The courtroom doors opened. Maria turned, then felt the blood drain from her face. Walking toward the witness stand was Thomas Chen, the elderly clerk from her mother's bank. "Mr. Chen," Bennett began after the oath was administered, "how long have you worked at First Community Bank?" 42 years, Chen replied, his voice quavering. "I'm retiring next month." "And in your position, did you recently assist Elena Martinez with accessing her safe deposit box?" "Yes, about 3 weeks ago." "Can you tell us what you observed?" Chen glanced at Maria, his expression pained. "Ms. Martinez came in with several old-looking documents. She asked me to notarize them as being from 1985. When I examined them closely, I noticed." He swallowed hard. "The paper wasn't aged properly. The ink was too fresh. I refused to notarize them." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Maria felt the room spinning. Her mother had accessed the safe deposit box recently, yes, to retrieve the original documents. But Chen's testimony made it sound like, "Your Honor," Bennett's voice cut through the chaos, "we have video evidence from the bank showing Ms. Martinez entering with an empty envelope and leaving with what appeared to be aged documents. We also have proof of recent purchases of specialized paper and ink designed to mimic documents from the 1980s. Davidson was objecting again, demanding time to review the evidence, but Maria barely heard him. She was watching Paul, who had finally turned to look at her. His expression wasn't triumphant or angry, it was cold, calculating, as if she were an equation he had successfully solved. Given the serious nature of these allegations, Judge Wheeler announced, "I am issuing an immediate stay on all proceedings related to the Richardson estate. Furthermore, I am ordering all documents in question be surrendered to the court for forensic examination." "Your Honor," Davidson interjected, "my client has the right to dash." "Your client," the judge cut in sharply, "should be more concerned about potential criminal charges. Attempting to defraud an estate of this magnitude is a serious offense. Mr. Bennett, I understand you're preparing a criminal complaint." "The paperwork is being filed as we speak, Your Honor." Maria felt John pulling her up, heard Davidson saying something about appeals and countermotions, but everything seemed distant, unreal. In the gallery, she caught a glimpse of her mother, face ashen, being approached by two men who looked suspiciously like federal agents. "Mom!" Maria started forward, but John held her back. "Not here," he whispered urgently. "Not now." They barely made it to Davidson's office before Maria collapsed into a chair, her whole body shaking. "How?" she demanded. "How did they do this?" Davidson looked grim. "They must have been planning this for weeks. The bank clerk, the forensic experts, the video evidence, it's all too perfectly orchestrated. But the documents are real." Maria's voice broke. "My mother would never dash." "I believe you," Davidson said quietly. "But belief isn't enough. They've poisoned the well. Even if we prove these specific allegations false, the taint of fraud will hang over everything. And with criminal charges in play." John paced the office like a caged animal. "There has to be something we can do." "There might be." Davidson hesitated. "But it's risky. Paul's case depends on painting this as a recent fraud attempt. If we could find evidence from earlier, independent proof that James Richardson acknowledged Maria as his daughter before all this started." Maria's phone buzzed. Another text from Paul, "You should have taken the deal. Say goodbye to your mother's green card." She stared at the message, something nagging at the edge of her mind. Paul had known about her mother's immigration status. Had known about the bank clerk, the safe deposit box. Had orchestrated everything down to the smallest detail. But how? The answer hit her like a thunderbolt. "The letters," she whispered. "What?" "The letters my father kept sending, the ones my mother never opened." Maria sat up straighter. "Paul must have found them when he was going through our father's things. That's how he knew everything, where we lived, the bank we used, all of it. But that means..." John's eyes widened. "That means the real documents exist somewhere in James Richardson's personal effects," Davidson finished. "Probably in his home office or company archives. Which Paul controls completely," Maria said bitterly. "Not completely." John pulled out his phone. "Remember last week at the hospital? That patient I was telling you about, the retired security guard?" Maria frowned. "The one who worked at Richardson Industries? For 30 years. He knew your father. And he still has friends inside the company." John's fingers flew over the keypad. "If those letters exist, he might know where to look." Hope flickered in Maria's chest, faint but persistent. Paul had spent weeks building his perfect trap, using her mother's past and her own desperation against her. He thought he had one. But he had made one crucial mistake. In his determination to bury the truth, he had preserved the very evidence that could expose him. As they left Davidson's office, Maria's phone buzzed one final time. The message was from an unknown number, but it wasn't Paul this time. "Your father kept everything. Meet me tomorrow at 8 p.m. Come alone." Attached was a photo that made Maria's breath catch: her father's private office, walls lined with filing cabinets, and clearly visible in the center drawer, a folder labeled Elena. The Richardson Industries building cast long shadows in the evening light, its glass facade reflecting the sunset like sheets of fire. Maria sat in her car across the street, watching employees stream out through the revolving doors. John's text messages had been increasingly urgent: "Don't go alone. It's obviously a trap. At least let me come with you." But the last message had been clear: "Come alone, or the documents disappear forever." At 7:55 p.m., she pulled on latex gloves, a habit from years of nursing, and crossed the street. The security guard barely glanced at her ID badge, a perfect replica created by John's mysterious contact. "Evening, Dr. Williams," he mumbled, waving her through. The executive floor was silent, emergency lights casting strange shadows across expensive artwork. Maria's footsteps echoed on marble floors as she followed the memorized path to James Richardson's private office. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure someone would hear it. The door was unlocked, just as promised. She slipped inside, closing it silently behind her. The office was exactly as shown in the photo: wood-paneled walls, leather furniture, filing cabinets stretching from floor to ceiling. The air smelled of leather and expensive cologne, so familiar it made her throat tight. How many times had her father sat here, reading her mother's unopened letters? "You're early." Maria spun around, heart leaping into her throat. A woman emerged from the shadows, tall, elegant, probably in her 60s. Even in the dim light, there was no mistaking that face. She'd seen it in countless society photos, always at James Richardson's side. "Margaret," Maria whispered. Paul's mother smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Sit down, Maria. We need to talk. If you're here to threaten me, I'm here to correct a mistake." Margaret moved to the desk, her heels clicking on hardwood. "One I made 35 years ago." Maria remained standing, poised to run. "You told my mother to disappear." "I did." Margaret's voice was steady, matter-of-fact. "I threatened her, intimidated her, used every weapon I had to protect my family. And for what?" She laughed bitterly. "James kept writing to her anyway. Kept sending money, birthday cards, Christmas gifts, all returned unopened. Your mother was stronger than I expected." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because my son has become everything I tried not to be." Margaret opened a drawer, removing a thick folder. "Cold. Calculating. Willing to destroy anyone who threatens his position." She placed the folder on the desk. "Including his own sister." Maria approached cautiously, opening the folder with trembling hands. Inside were dozens of letters, photographs, legal documents, all originals, their age evident in the yellowed paper and faded ink. "These prove everything," she breathed. "James kept meticulous records." Margaret's voice softened. "Every letter he wrote to you and your mother. Every return check. School reports he somehow obtained. Even hospital records from your birth." She paused. "He loved you, Maria. In his own way. Then why didn't he fight for you? Stand up to me?" Margaret shook her head. "Because he was a coward. He chose the easy path, sending secret letters, watching from afar, salving his conscience with money you never took." She met Maria's eyes. "But I'm not a coward. Not anymore." She pulled out her phone, playing a video. Paul's voice filled the office: just forge the documents, make them look old. Chen will play along, we have enough dirt on him. Once the judge sees them, her whole case falls apart. You recorded him, Maria realized. I recorded everything. Every meeting where he planned this fraud, every bribe, every threat. Margaret's smile was razor-sharp. A mother always knows her children's sins. Even when she wishes she didn't. Why help me now? Because Paul isn't just attacking you. He's destroying everything his father built, not the company or the money, but the principles James claimed to believe in. Honor. Integrity. Family. She handed Maria a USB drive. Everything you need is here. Bank records proving the original documents are genuine. Security footage of Paul accessing your mother's safe deposit box when she wasn't there. Emails detailing the whole scheme. Maria stared at the tiny drive. This will ruin him. It will save him, Margaret corrected. From becoming something worse than his father ever was. She moved to the window, staring out at the city lights. I destroyed one family to protect mine. I won't let Paul destroy another to protect his greed. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Margaret tensed. That's our signal. Take everything and go. Use the service elevator, my driver will meet you in the garage. Why should I trust you? Because I'm trying to save both my children. Margaret's eyes glistened. Paul needs to learn there are consequences. And you need to know your father loved you. Even if he was too weak to show it. The footsteps grew closer. Maria grabbed the folder and USB drive, then paused. What will you tell Paul? The truth. Finally. Margaret straightened her spine. Now go. And Maria? She smiled, genuinely this time. Welcome to the family. Maria slipped out through a hidden door just as Paul's voice boomed through the main office. She caught a glimpse of him confronting his mother, his face twisted with rage as he realized what had happened. In the garage, a black car waited with tinted windows. The driver handed her an envelope without speaking. Inside was a handwritten note from Margaret, the board meeting is tomorrow at 9 a.m. All the evidence will be presented. Be there. It's time everyone knew the truth. As the car pulled away, Maria's phone lit up with a message from an unknown number. The security footage is already being uploaded to the cloud. Paul can't delete it now. See you tomorrow, little sister. Maria clutched the folder to her chest, feeling the weight of decades of secrets within its pages. Tomorrow would change everything, not just for her, but for the entire Richardson family. Paul had tried to bury the truth, but he'd forgotten one crucial detail. Sometimes the biggest threats come from within. The Richardson Industries boardroom stretched before Maria like a gladiatorial arena. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, while a massive mahogany table dominated the space. Board members filled the leather chairs, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Paul stood at the head of the table, his composure cracking as he saw Maria enter with Davidson and John. This is a private meeting, he snapped. Security. Let her speak. Margaret's voice cut through the tension. She sat at the far end of the table, regal and unmovable. We're here to discuss the future of this company. That includes all of the Richardson family. She's not family, Paul snarled. She's a fraud. The courts dash. The courts were misled. Davidson stepped forward, placing a thick folder on the table. We have evidence proving that Mr. Paul Richardson orchestrated an elaborate scheme to discredit my client's claim to her inheritance. The boardroom erupted in murmurs. Paul's face flushed dark red. These are baseless accusations. Are they? Margaret pressed a button on the conference phone. Mr. Chen, you're on speaker. Please tell the board what you told me yesterday. The bank clerk's voice filled the room, shaking but clear. Mr. Richardson approached me 3 weeks ago. He threatened to expose my daughter's immigration status if I didn't testify that Ms. Martinez had forged documents. He paid me to lie in court. Paul lunged for the phone, but two board members blocked his path. Maria watched his desperate movements with a strange sense of calm. This man, who had tried to destroy her family, suddenly seemed small. There's more. Davidson distributed copies of emails, bank records, surveillance footage. Mr. Richardson accessed his father's private files without authorization. He used confidential information to target Maria and her mother. He bribed officials, falsified evidence, and committed perjury. You can't prove any of this, Paul growled. Actually, she can. A new voice joined the fray. An elderly man in a security uniform stepped into the room. I've worked here for 30 years. Mr. James Richardson trusted me to protect certain sensitive files. Including these. He placed a USB drive on the table. Every conversation, every meeting where you plotted against your sister. Your father's office was wired for security. Everything was recorded. Paul's face went ash white. Mother, he whispered. You knew. I knew everything. Margaret's voice cracked with emotion. Just like I knew when you started embezzling from the company last year. The boardroom exploded into chaos. Board members shouted questions, lawyers huddled in corners, security guards moved to block the exits. Through it all, Maria stood silent, watching her brother's world crumble. You're lying, Paul shouted, but his voice held a note of desperation. This is all a setup dash. Enough. The word cut through the noise like a blade. An elderly board member rose, his bearing radiating authority. I've been on this board for 40 years. I knew James Richardson when he was younger than you, Paul. He wasn't a perfect man, his treatment of Elena and Maria proves that. But he believed in legacy, in family, in doing what's right even when it's hard. He turned to Maria. Your father told me about you, years ago. He was ashamed of his weakness, his failure to acknowledge you publicly. But he made me promise that someday, the truth would come out. Paul laughed bitterly. So what now? You'll give her half the company? Let some stranger destroy everything we've built. No, Maria said quietly. Everyone turned to stare at her. I don't want your company. I don't even want all of the inheritance. She walked to the window, watching the city below. All my life, I wondered why my father abandoned us. I imagined him as a monster, then as a victim, then as something in between. But now I understand, he was just a man. Flawed, afraid, trying to fix his mistakes too late. She turned back to the board. I'll accept a quarter of the inheritance, enough to secure my mother's future and establish a foundation in my father's name. The foundation will provide scholarships for children of single mothers, focusing on healthcare education. Paul blinked, confusion replacing anger. You're giving up $75 million. I'm choosing what matters. Maria met his eyes. Family isn't about money or power. It's about legacy, the kind that helps others, that makes the world better. Margaret smiled through tears. James would have loved that idea. The board members exchanged glances, then the elderly member spoke again, all in favor of accepting Miss Henderson's proposal. Hands rose around the table. Paul stared at them, then at his mother, then finally at Maria. Something shifted in his expression, not quite acceptance, but perhaps understanding. The children, he said suddenly. What? My kids. Your nieces and nephew. Paul's voice was rough. They should know their aunt. Maria felt tears prick her eyes. I'd like that. Later, standing in her father's office, Maria found one last letter she'd missed. Dated just weeks before his death, it read, My dearest daughter, I know these words come too late. I've spent a lifetime hiding from my mistakes, trying to protect a legacy while forgetting what legacy truly means. But you, your strength, your dignity, your mother's unshakable integrity, you are my true legacy. Someday, I hope you'll understand that the inheritance I leave isn't about money. It's about truth, about choices, about being better than I was. I love you. I've always loved you. And I'm so very proud of the woman you've become. John found her there, tears streaming down her face. You okay? Maria smiled, tucking the letter away. I am now. As they left the building, she saw Paul watching from his office window. He raised his hand in a tentative wave. Maria waved back, feeling the weight of decades of pain and anger finally begin to lift. Some inheritances, she realized, were worth more than money. Truth, forgiveness, the chance to heal old wounds, these were her father's final gifts. And unlike his fortune, they were things worth sharing.